Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 1313 or 1313. Today I will look at a specific book, Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner by Johnston. It is amazing with Wittgenstein is that you can come back and you can come back and you can come back. There's always something new to uncover. How could I put it? It's like the points he's making are the first time you see them too delicate or too unnecessary. They don't seem to be very revealing or significant, maybe it's a better word. And that's why I put as the first pointer regarding both the book, excellently written by Johnston, and the master himself, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And to understand deep very often is very, very superficial misunderstandings. It's not always the case, but often one gets a feeling that these are incredibly superficial and uninteresting things. But trust me, hidden or out in the open seem sometimes to be the very same thing. The difference of completely inner and completely hidden for view and being out in the open, it is far from being very different. He is almost like a Zen master that opens the veil of illusion. There's some hints, but you see it's very hard to say something definite about especially the later Wittgenstein. So I will read something from the book and I will do a little extension of what I read later. So we'll start in the second paragraph of page 195. And I apologize from the beginning, it's a light book, but it's still heavy on my wrists. I see how much I can cope. To underline this point, consider a more unusual example, the concept love. Suppose an individual is involved with two people and we are uncertain which she loves most. The first inclination is to assume that if we do not know this, she must. To a certain extent, this is correct, for if she says she loves one of them, and not the other, this may be enough to settle the matter. With a sophisticated concept like love. However, the language game allows for the possibility of self-deception and lack of self-knowledge. Furthermore, the individual herself may be genuinely uncertain which she loves, so that in that sense even she would not know her inner. To resolve the question, we might propose various tests. For example, if she has to choose between them, we might take that as decisive. However, the tests may conflict. And the normal use of the concept love does not establish any of them as definitive. We may therefore conclude that there is no determinate answer as to who she loves the best. Her inner state is not something that we cannot know, because we cannot penetrate the veil of the outer. Rather, there is nothing determinate to know. We could specify a new test to decide what conclusion we should reach. But the point is that our existing concept is not of this nature. Like other psychological concepts, it has a degree of indeterminacy built into it. The circumstances of her later life may persuade us and her to view her feelings one way or another. On the other hand, we may simply accept that there is no answer, that there is no simple way of describing what she felt. Here, the indeterminacy of the inner is a feature of its very essence. This example highlights our tendency to take the inner for granted. We want to treat it as an object which is simply there, and if we encounter difficulties describing it, we blame these on its inaccessibility. In fact, it is better seen as a construct, a picture we use in our mutual understanding. Our ability to view each other's actions and statements as expressions of an inner presupposes a kinship between us. For there is no guarantee that such an understanding should exist. It is conceivable, for example, that we should come across people who were simply unable to find our feet with. Their behavior, while not random, may strike us as illogical, and it may be impossible for us to relate it to the patterns that characterize our lives. The same point applies to the patterns, to the utterances. For as we saw earlier, statements such as the vowel E is yellow, or everything feels unreal to me, are literally nonsensical, and yet we can find each other through them, so much that such unique, non-paraphrasable communication can be what means most to us. The kinship which lies behind our psychological concepts also makes itself apparent in another way. For what gives unity to these varying and irregular patterns is our sense that they group together what belongs together. In this way, we are able to treat a host of different things. For instance, facial expression, a gesture, a piece of behavior, and some utterances as expressions of the same inner state. There is no guarantee, however, that we should be able to understand all living beings in this way. In principle, there is no reason why the linguistic and non-linguistic reactions of all beings should be the same. As Wittgenstein famously remarked, if a lion could talk, we could not understand him. Similarly, we might come across apparently intelligent people whose action we could make no sense of. In such a case, what should we say of their inner life? Depending on how different their lives were from ours, we might conclude depending on how different their lives were from ours, we might conclude either that their inner life was simply different from ours, or that they had no inner life at all. That is, that they were not, in fact, the conscious beings they appeared to be. Here, it is also interesting to consider our conception of the inner life of a mad person. For we tend to think of this as an indescribable flux, and yet the incoherence of this flux is simply a symbol of the incoherence of her actions. To sum up, we can see three related aspects our language game as contributing to the indeterminacy which characterize it. First, it is a game based on fine shades, and one where the criteria are not fixed. The idea that talk of knowledge is inappropriate reflects the fact that one must be acquainted with the person to be able to judge what significance to ascribe to his expressions of feelings. And also that one can't describe what it is that one recognizes in them. Second, the consequences of a particular inner state are not rigidly determined. One can not say what the essential observable consequences of an inner state are. When, for example, he is really pleased, what is then to be expected of him, and what not? There are, of course, such characteristic consequences, but they cannot be described in the same way as reactions, which characterize the state of a physical object. Finally, the importance of variation and the consequent flexibility of our concepts mean that there is no rigid fit between our concepts and experience, that the inner is not always determinate. Genuineness and its opposite are not the only essential characteristics of an expression of feeling. One can't, for example, say whether a cat which purrs and then lashes out was pretending. It could be that a person gives signs of joy and then acts in a completely unexpected manner. And yet we could not say that the first expression was not genuine. If we now ask, could these uncertainties be eliminated? There is no clear answer to the question. The impossibility of knowing what someone else is feeling is in a sense both a physical and a logical impossibility. First of all, one can think of possible ways of gaining information about another person that do not in fact exist. So there is a physical impossibility. If, for example, we could read someone's thoughts directly from her nervous system, our current game would be undermined. Why bother with uncertain utterances, one might argue, if you can read the book? On the other hand, there is a logical impossibility in that our game is characterized by the absence of more exact rules of evidence. Throwing over the game would involve a huge change in our lives and would radically change our relation to others as well as to ourselves. How would the fact that others could predict our behavior affect our relation to ourselves? Would we still regard our deeds as our own? Or would we view our own lives fatalistically as the playing out of a mechanical process? the hypothesis that we could read and so predict the behavior of others conjures up a completely new world, and it is hard to follow through the hypothesis. And to be sure, how we might react to this world. In the end, the question of whether we would accept a different game is an open one. And here is a quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein. There now remains the question whether we would give up our language game, which rests on imponderable evidence and often leads to uncertainty. If we had the possibility of exchanging it for a more exact one, which on the whole had similar consequences. We could, for example, work with a mechanical lie detector and redefine a lie as whatever produces a certain result on the lie detector. The question, therefore, is, would we change our form of life if such and such were placed at our disposal? And how could I answer that? Where, then, does all this leave the inner outer picture? As we have seen, this picture is neither an expression of metaphysical truth nor a depiction of the facts of the matter. Rather, the picture expresses certain conceptual relations which together form our concept of the human subject. Here is worth reconsidering our earlier discussion of thinking and consciousness. For now, we can set these issues in a wider context. As we noted then, thinking cannot be represented accurately, either as an activity in itself or as an accompaniment of other activities. Rather, the word thinkingly, as opposed to mechanically, characterizes the way an activity is carried out. One way of capturing this difference is to treat thought as if it were a continuous inner monologue. For example, when a man acts intelligently, we may say it's almost as though he spoke to himself. In such cases, however, there is no necessity for the individual actually to talk to herself. Rather, the point is that there is a potential explanation of all she is doing, and that if she is interrupted and asked, she will be able to give it. Here, the possibility of giving an explanation is pictured in terms of a continuous activity of thinking. Similarly, the difference in the way the person acts, the fact that she acts thinkingly, is represented in terms of a special supplementary activity. The person who acts thinkingly does many things which someone acting mechanically does not. And thinking is the imaginary auxiliary activity, the invisible stream which carries and connects all these kinds of actions. Talk of the inner is a way of representing these ideas. The world of consciousness and ceaseless flow of thoughts and experiences is a picture which captures our concept of a subject. As well as expressing certain conceptual relations, the inner-outer picture captures fundamental aspects of our relation to others. Indeed, to the extent that the inner seems irredeemably mysterious, this reflects our sense of the mystery of life. As we saw, the absence of predictability and mechanical regularity is central in our response to something as alive and more particularly as human. This has a qualitative difference between our reaction even to an animal and to a complex machine. And that difference goes beyond the fact that the actions of the latter are easier to describe in mathematical terms. Watching an animal, we see it as alive. Just as looking into the face of a human being, we see it as conscious. Here, the inner-outer picture connects up with our deepest feelings and reactions. As Wittgenstein notes, I am inclined to speak of a lifeless thing as lacking something. I see life definitely as a plus. As something added to a lifeless thing. Similarly, a human face makes a unique impression upon us. The expression of soul in a face, one really needs to remember that the face with the soulful expression can be painted in order to believe that it is merely shapes. and colors that makes this impression. It is not to be believed that it is merely the eyes, eyeball, lids, eyelashes, etc. of a human being that one can be lost in the gaze of, into which one can look with astonishment and delight. And yet, human eyes just do affect one like this. Such reactions are important because they illustrate the attitudes which underlie our language game. The notion of the inner may be a picture, but it captures the essence of our relationship to others and to ourselves. One way of underlining the special role which the inner outer picture plays in our lives is to note that talk of someone having an inner can hardly be called an opinion. For example, when we look into someone's eyes with astonishment and delight, it would seem strange to say that we merely believed she has a soul. Here the word believe goes against the grain. For it treats something pivotal to our whole lives as on the same level as a contingent truth. What would it be like to believe someone had a soul or inner? And discover she didn't. It could hardly be compared to discovering that someone who we believed lived in London actually lived in Manchester. In fact, the claim that someone has an inner is an expression of our relation to her as a human being, not the statement of an empirical truth. Thus, while we might say of someone, I believe she is suffering. Thus, while we might say of someone, I also believe she isn't an automaton. One way of illustrating this is by considering what it would actually mean to say that someone was not an automaton. What information would this give if it was said of another human being? None, or at the very most, that this man always behaves like a human being. And not occasionally like a machine. The statement that someone is not an automaton conveys no information, because what it expresses is a relation that precedes opinion. My attitude towards her is an attitude towards a soul. I am not of the opinion that she has a soul. But what is the difference between an attitude and an opinion? I might say attitudes come before opinions. In the case of the soulless tribe, what would change if we cease to regard them as soulless? Would be our whole relation to them. In part, this might manifest itself in changes in the way we treat them. For example, as Norman Malcolm suggested in Wittgenstein's lectures, when the slaves become useless, we shall no longer do away with them. However, the use of the picture itself expresses a change in our relation to them. Indeed, at the extreme one could imagine distinguishing between beings where the essential expression of the distinction was the choice of picture we used to describe their essence. Thus, normally, if you say, he is an automaton, you draw consequences. If you stab him, he'll feel no pain. On the other hand, you may not wish to draw any such consequences, and this is all there is to it, except further muddles. So, a little intermission, and we will continue with rethinking the inner. Now we just enter into chapter 7. The mind, the brain, and the soul. The prejudice in favor of psychophysical parallelism is also a fruit of the primitive conception of grammar. For if one accepts a causality between psychological phenomena that is not mediated physiologically, one is taken to have thereby admitted the existence alongside the body of a soul, a ghostly spiritual entity. The account of the inner outlined in this book is likely to face two contrasting challenges. Some will complain, as Iris Murdoch has done, that Wittgenstein's approach to the inner comes dangerously close to denying the most crucial aspect of an individual's existence. In contrast, others will argue that Wittgenstein has not gone far enough and is himself still a prisoner of the anthropocentric myth that human consciousness is somehow special. However, as we shall try to show in this chapter, both these criticisms misrepresent Wittgenstein's argument. Indeed, both are founded on the very confusions he was trying to undermine. Rebutting these criticisms should further clarify the thrust of Wittgenstein's argument and illuminate the non-substantive nature of his philosophy. It will also enable us to underline the importance of distinguishing our shared notion of the inner and associated ideas such as the mind on the one hand, from moral or religious concepts such as the soul, and on the other, from scientific concepts such as the brain. We shall conclude by considering Freud, whose work seems to pose a particular challenge to Wittgenstein's account. For it seems to refute our current psychological concepts and also to present a scientific but substantive view of what human life is really about. Let us begin, however, by considering the idea that Wittgenstein is, in some sense, denying the existence of the inner. Here, talk of existence is already a sign of confusion. For this suggests that what is at stake is whether a particular thing or object exists, whereas the real issue is the significance of a particular concept or group of concepts. That we use the concept of the inner cannot be denied. What needs to be clarified is the particular grammar of this type of concept. The exact philosophical terminology we use to clarify the inner is not important. As Wittgenstein said elsewhere, say what you choose, so long as it does not prevent you from seeing the facts. What does matter, however, is clarity.